much. Just to give you a little background, this is Orca Network, started in 1995 for Lolita, who is captured in Penn Cove and is still in Miami. And our other organizations now are branches within Orca Network, which are the Lolita Campaign, the Whale Sighting Network, which is sort of the most dynamic current almost every day that there are whales or dolphins out there. There are reports. The Langley Whale Center, come on by anytime. It's in Langley, can't miss it, on Anthes Street. And the Central Puget Sound Marine Mammal Stranding Network, which is a misnomer. It really should be North Puget Sound, if Puget Sound at all, because we are island and Skagit. So all of Skagit beaches, if a marine mammal washes up or looks like it's in trouble on the beach, give us a call or give NOAA a call and they'll call us. Because we are permitted by NOAA to do the exams and the necropsies when it's called for. And our education programs like this. So we try to just get the word out and advocate and educate for whales all the time. And this is just a little sampler of what the sighting network is like. This is on Vashon Island when K-Pod was coming by, and they go by Point Robinson, often very close, and there's just always a bunch of people there, and that's when the excitement just kind of wells up because everybody's just so happy to see whales and have their own stories to tell. So it really helps to get people to experience the whales, and that's sort of what we go for. And this is just to give you a little bit of a gray whale talk in about 30 seconds, which is there are 10 very unique gray whales that come in every year, and some since 1991, to a very restricted area of Saratoga Passage and Possession Sound around Everett, and they know where the food is, and they come into the mud flats and dig out the shrimp and fill their bellies for a couple of months there, and then head on out and probably up to the Bering Sea, we don't know. But there have been some anomalies this year, these that stayed. Usually they leave by May, but these are a couple of newcomers, and they violated all the rules. They stayed all year, all summer, fall, and they're still there right now. And plus one of the regulars, a little patch. So that's exciting news too. And this is the Whale Center, just so you'll know what to look for if you drop by. That's our ocean listening station, where it's a touch screen where you can listen to every kind of whale and seabirds and rain falling and all sorts of other ocean sounds to sort of get an idea of what the whales actually experience. And this is just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from and where our organization is coming from, our education sort of emanates out of. And this is the Center for Whale Research on San Juan Island, where I started in 1981. It's still a thriving organization, and it is the scientific field station that has put together all of the demographics and all the numbers to let us know how many there are, how are they doing, what are the trends. It's their data that enabled NOAA and the courts to list the southern residents as endangered in 2005. It's invaluable data, and it's very current. Of course, it helps that this is a population that stays around or comes around every year and is not that hard to find. They're almost like urban whales. They are very accustomed to having people around and to being seen. I mean, of course, I'm not minimizing the possibilities of noise being an issue, but they are used to having people around, and they come into these inland waters, and they, as the studies discovered way back in the 70s, they are a cohesive, intact population. No in or out migration, no interaction with any other communities anywhere. So the same ones every year. So you can document each individual and know the exact population every year. And that's what the Center for Whale Research has done. Not to minimize the challenges of that either, keeping the boats going and the research and everything going, but the whales do lend themselves to it. So focusing on the Southern Resident Orcas, J, K, and L pod, I want to ask and try to answer, how are they doing? Which is a really big question that a lot of people are very keyed into just now. But also, who are they? And I do mean who, as members of their families, of their communities, of having the cognitive and the emotional ability to be members, to have personalities. They are persons in a very big way within their own communities, but that's how they live. But also, you know, I would really love to just tell stories. I think Jane Goodall is right. Telling stories is a way to get people to understand. The power of storytelling is really important, but we just don't have 4 or 5 hours tonight. I could, but I'm going to have to cover a lot of information. So I'll let the photos sort of be the stories. There are a lot of really beautiful pictures in here, and you can sort of piece together what's going on there with each one. But first I have to cover the blessed event. The birth of L124, documented by the Center for Whale Research on January 11th. On the 10th, this was an assemblage of all 3 pods. This was a super pod event, which has been very rare in recent years. So, and they went all the way down into Puget Sound, and King and Como had their choppers overhead and got really good footage, raw footage without any titles, narration, but some of the good experts looked at it and said, not only those are JK and L pod, but there's a new baby. And so when they left out of Puget Sound the next day on the 11th, they had their boats and their veteran researchers handy with their big long lens cameras and got photos of every single member, which with the new baby was 75. So that was a really amazing day that was just a boon to not only the population, but the research on the population. What was kind of interesting was that there were also transients in that chopper footage that was on the air all the time, and nobody made note of that, but some of the veteran researchers did see that and say, wait a minute, those are the T-137s. And they were actually going south while the 75 southern residents were going north. The residents were hugging the Vashon shore, while the transients were hugging the West Seattle shore. They were only a couple of miles apart, but they studiously avoided each other. And that is the hallmark. That's typical and normal when they're in close proximity. They just go around each other. It's very interesting. And I'll get into that a little more here. But I want to give you just a quick sense of how southern residents are so different, so unique. You can't just, like a lot of people say, well, northerns will come in, or there's just more transients, so there's still whales. But southern residents are different. They're really unique. They're more active. And this is not a scientific survey. This is just listening and hearing stories of people who are doing research on other populations around the world. And they say, no, these southern residents are really active. They are more likely to just kind of play around, just breach and do all kinds of behaviors that have no names or biological purpose. They just splashing water around. It's hard to explain. But they're more social too. They're more bonded together. They show it more. They swim in whenever they can, I believe, because they have to work a lot. There's a lot of foraging going on. Oh yeah, keeping the ice cream here. They have to forage a lot, but when they can, they often bunch up really tight. And it's such a beautiful sight to see, the families together, the grandmas, moms, and all their kids and nieces and nephews, and they travel in these tight groups sometimes, whenever they can. And they're just more playful. they just seem to be more playful. And I'm talking just in comparison to other orcas around the world. And I'll give you a sort of an overview of those in just a few. But they're, you know, sure they have to eat, but they sure like to play. And they just seem to roll around on each other and splash and do all kinds of crazy antics. And they're curious. They kind of want to check you out. They got very good eyes, and they tend to like to spy hop, as we call it. I mean, they may do that when there's nobody around, so you can't really say specifically that's always because they want to see who you are. But a lot of times they'll come around to where you are on the shore or on a boat and just, you know, poke up and take a look, and they can see you, and they will, you know that they're watching you at the same time. And so they have very good memories, and they know people. They do recognize faces. So they just sort of want to know who's watching them. They're very curious and interactive in that way. And they have open saddle patches. No others around the world. I mean, there are other fish-eating resident populations that have a smaller percentage, but basically there are just more of these open saddle patches like you see here with southern residents than anywhere else in the world. That's one way you can tell they're not transients, because the transients don't have open saddles at all. Which one? Oh, the open saddle patch. Let's see if I can do that openness right there relative to just a solid flat, you know, shape. But they do need their salmon. They specialize in that, and they have to hunt for it all the time. Sometimes it seems easy. They just kind of roll over and come up with a salmon in their mouth. But a lot of times it's a whole lot of work. And so we, more and more over the last 5 to 10 years or so, we see them spread out like this. And this really minimizes it. They're sometimes 10 miles of the group. And they're still in acoustic contact. They can still yell to each other most of the time. But spread out, scanning every nook and cranny, every bit of that entire undersea canyon along the walls, in the kelp beds, looking for those salmon. And no doubt they alert each other if they see several. And they do share their food, as I'll show you. And this is very perplexing that they could be so specialized. For almost anybody that is new to this, especially if you have a strong biological background, because you can't say that about bears or really almost any other animal, you know, that will eat opportunistically whatever they can that is in their range and where they are in their habitat. They will, you know, usually sample it. But orcas are creatures of tradition. They learn as a calf from their mother and their elders and their whole community what constitutes food, and they stick to it. And that is passed down over the generations as learning, as knowledge. It's not a genetic predilection. It's not a matter of enzymes. Of course, after 100,000 generations or so, they will specialize, slightly in their anatomies to be able to take down whatever is their preferred prey. But that choice comes first, a traditional choice. Nobody knows, just where it originates, but it's just unlike any other animal in that way. I'll get back to that, but maybe some other whales are like that, and it's a matter of degree, of course, but to a degree that is matched only with human societies. Basically, is this virtually complete and total adherence to what is learned as in their youth from birth, is how they live, and that's a really crucial thing that is hard to grasp. So just to sort of broaden the scope here, to sort of give you the context of where southern residents come from, the backstory, the natural history, and that is, of course, you probably know, that cetaceans are marine mammals, and they are all evolved from land mammals. If you go back about 50 million years, furry little grazing animals, with hooves that found, some protection from predators and some good food in the water and went further and further into the water, and over 10 or 12 million years began to live totally and actually be able to give birth in the water. And then they branched into the baleen whales and the toothed whales about 30 million years ago. And they are the largest of the dolphins, so they're within the dolphin family. And they have no predators. And being the largest of the dolphins and being so socially attuned and having each other's backs all the time, they have been able to live without fear, without flight or fight. They've been able to completely avoid that kind of tension and anxiety and just build their lives, just, develop their cultures, develop their ways of life. And that's a really sort of a key thing to keep in mind, that they really are fearless. And you can see it when you see them travel by. That's something that just kind of comes off of them. They're not twitchy. They're not, ready to jump. They just, they're masters of their world, and it's beautiful to see. They are the most widespread large animal on Earth, considering that Earth is 70% ocean, and they're in every part of the ocean. They are found in the tropics, along the equator, mostly toward the polar areas and subpolar, because that's where the food is for the most part. But they are found everywhere on Earth. There aren't any that we know of that travel the entire Earth. In each of these locations, there are different separate communities of orcas. But in all of that, and in all of recorded and traditional indigenous histories, there's no record of them harming a human. But we know they can, because when they're put in captivity and driven completely crazy, they lose those cultural underpinnings and those traditions and those, community and family, parameters, and sometimes just lose it and will strike out. It's very rare considering what they go through, but as we've seen, it does happen. Just covered that. They are voluntary breathers as marine mammals. They've got to breathe, but they came from land where they breathed air, and then they went into the ocean. So they've still got to get back to that air all the time. So they've got to time it perfectly when they come up, and just exhale and inhale within about a second and a half, and completely refill their lungs for a long dive. But they've got to get that air every time. And their gestation is about 17 months. They carry their babies a long, long time, and they're very well developed when they come out. They've got to swim, and they do from day one. Switch, there we are. And just to give you what Southern Residents' dimensions are, males about 22.5 feet, females about 19.7, and this is from drone studies. We used to think they were quite a bit bigger, but then they got actual measurements, and they're exactly that. Newborns are 7 or 8 feet and 300 or 400 pounds. And I say that to pinpoint these are Southern Residents, because as you'll see in a minute, there are others that are bigger and others that are smaller around the world, which is really kind of interesting. But Southern Residents are about average among all the different populations around the world. And they use this amazing echolocation that comes out of these nasal sacs. They have one blowhole, even though all baleen whales and all other mammals really have two. We got two blowholes. But They have one because their other nasal passages are used for sound production, and that is including echolocation and all of their acoustic calls and languages that they communicate with each other. And then they receive those by these highly innervated lower jaws. And that's how they get their sounds and process them. And they do dive. This is from a suction cup study showing how deep they dive, which around here is about 650 feet, which is as far as they need to go to get their food. There are others around the world that have been recorded at more than 1,000 feet. So this isn't their biological limit, but it's as far as they quite often do dive around here because that's where their salmon can be found, some of them. And that little tiny box at the top there, that's a SeaWorld tank, just to give you a sense of the comparison of the space available to an orca in a tank. And of course, the one that Lolita is in Miami is even smaller than that. It's not as deep as she is long, if you can imagine that. So that's their normal kind of diving pattern. And each community has these amazing calls. So let's see if our sound system is hooked up here. I want to play. There we go. Wow, did that play? I love that last honk. Shows their variety. Yeah, that was during a superpod in 1995, actually, when there were about 98 of them in Harrow Strait on a clear, calm night, and it was a beautiful night. But each one of those calls is a discrete call that is documented, annotated, spectrogrammed, and studied. And each community has completely different sets of calls. So if you don't want to call it language, that's your call, but to me, I don't see the difference. It looks like it's a learned language that they use on a constant basis. And they do share their prey normally. And in fact, that's true of orcas around the world. No matter if they eat seals or minke whales or sharks or stingrays, they tend to share their food with their family members. And they also sometimes wear them, and I don't understand this at all. For a couple of weeks in many summers, it's usually the juveniles, and they'll just throw a fish on their head and see how long they can keep it there, I guess. I'm not sure what the game is, but maybe it's a friendly competition or showing off. I don't know what it is. But it's sort of one of the things that makes Southern residents enduring. And this is a paper that came out a couple years ago that establishes that orca females go through a menopause that is unlike any other animal except humans in terms of the duration of it. Other animals, almost every other, can continue to reproduce and give birth right up to the end of their lives. But with orcas, their reproductive years are very much like ours, mid-teens to about 40 years old, but then they can live another several decades to 60, 80, maybe 100, but without reproducing. So that is the classic menopause. And they have the longest, basically, of any species but humans. So that's a discovery that was made based on the research from the Center for Whale Research. It was suspected many years ago, but it was documented anyway and proven by this team from Exeter College in the UK. So now, to dig a little deeper into orca cultures, and I kind of dwell on this because it is so critical to understanding anything. You know, every bit of their behavior comes out of their cultural traditions, of what they learn to conform with their you know, what their elders, basically, they're usually mother, but their elders have taught them. And so just to sort of give you a sense of their evolutionary history that goes back, you can sort of see it's a complicated slide, but you can see where the orcas are, and they've got them as among the very, very first of the dolphins, and originating from, it's a sparse fossil record, but about 8.3 million years ago. So they've been, you know, the top predator in the ocean for at least 8 million years. And they live in, as I mentioned, and this is a quote from Lance Barrett Leonard in Vancouver, they live in a bewildering variety of exclusive sympatric, meaning in the same habitats in many, many cases, cultures that are mutually exclusive. I mean, they swim around each other and over, you know, thousands of generations do not interbreed. It's amazing. Which around here, the mammal-eating transients that we see around here and more increasingly as southern residents are struggling, the transients that have an abundant food supply of harbor seals primarily, but also porpoise, they're doing fine. They are increasing and they're around much more often and in larger groups and seem to be doing really well. But they are, you could sort of say, at least from the genetic record that we have, they're the original orcas. They're sort of the prototype from which the other types have branched off. And the salmon-eating resident types that are found in the North Pacific in probably 5 different communities are much more recent, going back a little over 120,000 years. They came over from the Atlantic during the interglacials when they could swim over the North Pole in a couple of different times and branched into these different communities from Kamchatka to here, to the southern residents. They're more recent. And then we have the offshores that I'll mention that are sort of in between. They're kind of transients and residents genetically, although there's no interaction between them and any others. And I just want to give you an example of a slight morphological difference in the shape of the dorsal fin between residents and the transients. U48 or 84 there, the transient in the photo, is a U because we don't know exactly which community that one came from. You know, there is a catalog of the transients. It's got, I think, about 250 in it, but this one wasn't in that. And so they give it a U, but it's traveling with transients and it's obviously a mammal eater, so it's a transient, but it's a U until they can figure out which catalog to put it in. So this is a good snapshot of the world populations. This is a great illustrator, Uko Gorder in Seattle, who has put these together. And this sort of gives you on the right there are the northern hemisphere, on the left are the southern hemisphere, and it starts with residents and lumps all of the 5 resident populations into one as a type, the fish-eating residents, and then all of the transient populations together, and then the offshores, and then the North Atlantic populations, which are completely different. Some eat herring, specialize in herring, but there are some, at least parts of communities that are found eating herring in the summer off Iceland, who then go down to the north coast of Scotland and pick off a few seals. So it's not like it's impossible for them to, you know, eat either mammals or fish. They can eat both. So that just sort of underscores that it's a learned tradition rather than something that is genetically programmed. And this gives you a sense when if you look at the differences in size, the size of the eye patch there, you know, and some of the coloration. Some of them in the Antarctic have these great racing stripes, you know, that come up to the eye. It's really kind of fascinating when you look at all the different types of orcas there are around the world. And that has led much of the scientific community to say, wait a minute, how many species are we dealing with here? Are they separate species? And so there's been these attempts, and it's been like 10 years of debate and no real resolution of it, because some are saying, no, they're really all the same species. They just tend to live in these very small communities, and they really are small. Around the world, most of the communities of orcas that are found, and I have to also emphasize there's very little field work done anywhere else. I mean, a little, you know, this is the heart of it, where it started and where the field studies are very current and up to date every year. But even the northern community and the transients, they can't find and document every member every year reliably. And then when you get to the Bering Sea and to the North Sea and the Atlantic and the Antarctic that are found in among the icebergs, there's just very little really good documentation of any other population around the world. So, you know, it's very hard to know how to divide them up or what are the characteristics. But from what is known, they live in small communities of a couple of hundred, 200 or 300 is the normal size for a community. And it's really kind of a coincidence, I don't think so, that a lot of tribal mythology says if you get a tribe that has more than a couple of hundred people, you kind of lose the cohesion. You lose the sense of oneness. And, you know, maybe that's something they discovered millions of years ago, and that's just sort of how they form their communities, is into these, you know, big extended families, but they're really small populations. They don't just multiply according to the carrying capacity of their habitat. They have some kind of inner gyroscope or monitor that maintains an optimum population size, which, you know, I mean, the world is finite for a top predator. And so I think maybe they made mistakes about 8 million years ago and learned to, you know, recraft their traditions and their cultures to fit the world as they found it. And this is really what is the foundation of the studies now and the understanding. And this is from 2001, Culture in Whales and Dolphins. And what this says right there in the abstract is that basically orca cultures have no parallel except in humans. And that's not really a perfect parallel. There's, you know, a lot of differences. But in terms of the strength of the bonding of each individual to their community, to their cultural identity, you don't find that anywhere else in nature except in orcas. And this is really hard. And I don't want to be misunderstood here. I want, you know, please understand that biology is the foundation of everything we know and their lives. I mean, biology means life, the study of life. So, you know, that is where you start to understand the whales. But when you're getting into their cultural traditions, their identities, their bonds and their specialized behaviors, it doesn't follow the biological rules or the ecological rules or the evolutionary rules. The biologists, you know, it's a field, and people are trained, and they're trained in concepts and terminology. And what we find in orcas is a bit above and beyond that in terms of you know, you really have to talk about cultural cohesion and tradition and identity and you know, self-awareness and self-determination and, you know, a lot of terms that biologists are not comfortable with. So even though this came out in 2001, and you know, absolutely reputable top-of-the-line scientists, and nobody has disputed this basic finding, they still don't really study according to this around the world. They're still looking at, you know, demographic patterns and carrying capacity and you know, sort of the same kind of concepts that come out of biology, which you know, it could use a sort of an overhaul. I mean, the whole science of orca studies could use, you know, a little bit more input from what we call the humanities, anthropology, sociology, you know, the studies of human behavior. Some of that does carry over to orca studies, but it just really hasn't been applied, not in a theoretical way. So anyway, back to reality. There are these communities, just to sort of show you what we have around here in the North Pacific, I mean, Northeast Pacific especially. There are these 4 known resident fish-eating communities and 4 transient communities, and they're much less well defined. As you saw, there was that unknown. So there are surprises, and the lines are redrawn often when new discoveries are found, but basically they're understood to be in these 4 different communities. And then the offshores that are 20, 30 miles, they're out along the outer edge of the continental shelf, all the way from Alaska to California. And they travel in big groups and they eat sharks. That's their primary diet. So just to give you a sense of transients, as I mentioned, they're doing really well. That's sort of a diagnostic dorsal fin. It's very sharp on the top. Residents have much more rounded dorsal fins, but that's not, you know, a perfect ironclad rule, because sometimes the transients have rounded tops too. It is a little bit beat up, and often they are. And you know, when you take down a 2,000-pound stellar sea lion, they might fight back. And so they do get scratched up by their food sometimes. But just to sort of give you an overview, transients eat only mammals, residents eat only not just fish, but certain species, especially Chinook. I'll get to that. Transients in small groups, although they're in larger and larger groups as they sort of grow in size and as their prey base is, you know, growing. Seals, primarily, harbor seals. The residents are in larger groups. They use different vocalizations, slightly different sizes, and no interaction between them, and they don't compete for food. The originator of the studies, Mike Bigg in Canada, used to say it's as if they have a treaty between them to agree to not compete. You know, they don't get in each other's way. And that seems to be the case because it all leads to sympatric speciation, which is becoming different species in the same habitat, which is unheard of anywhere else, or with any other species, I should say. And then there are the northern residents that are doing pretty well too, actually. They've been increasing. There's quite a lot of them, over 300 now. And they seem to find, they eat the same food, basically. I mean, a few variations, but they eat Chinook primarily. And they seem to be doing really well. And it seems that the Chinook that come in from the Pacific to spawn in the rivers, especially the Columbia Basin, go through their territory first. So they get first dibs. And so they, you know, get all they want first. And then they come down into the range of the southern residents and there's not as many of them by the time they do. A question there?
Where are the northern residents
good.
located?
Good. Question is, where are the northern residents located? And they are north of Georgia Strait, starting with Johnstone Strait and way up into southeast Alaska, Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlottes, and the north half, usually, down to Strait of Juan de Fuca sometimes, of the west side of Vancouver Island, but not in the inland waters. And the offshores, like I said, they're out there on the continental shelf. About 350 of them. There is a catalog. It's not, as current, but every now and then there's a good research expedition to go out, and they sometimes opportunistically come within range of the north end of Vancouver Island a lot. So the photos are taken. And the beauty of it is the photo ID method. And that was originated in the early 70s by Mike Bigg, the pioneer researcher, because before that, the way you studied virtually any animals was you tended to have to kill them, and then you'd measure their anatomies and get their diagnostic shapes and sizes and colors and everything. But to study whales, they didn't want to do that. And after he, took a survey and was out there with them, Mike Bigg, he realized he was seeing the same ones year after year. So he devised this method, photo ID. And this is Center for Whale Research catalog page, just sort of a sample 2-page spread to show you how they can be documented as members of their families. So it's like a family album with a family tree. And those come out on an irregular basis every year or two. And so this is the 2016 version. So the studies have been greatly enhanced by the poop sniffing dogs. And it's quite the method. Sam Wasser at UW has, perfected this with many animals, land animals, as well as orcas. And it gives rich information, all of those things that you want to know: stress hormones, pathogens, toxins, diseases, parasites. Everything can be told from that poop. It's just got to be analyzed, and you got to have a dog that tells you where to go to scoop it up, with a fine mesh net. It floats for several minutes, 8 or 10 minutes. And so you got to get there in a hurry, but they can smell them from a quarter mile away. So they're excellent research assistants. And what that study has shown in recent years was this pretty alarming headline that came out in 2017 from those studies, which is that population growth is limited by the nutritional deficiencies, basically, and that about 70% of the pregnancies end in miscarriages or do not end in a live birth. And that's drastic in any population. And just to sort of underline that, in the last 10 years, since 2009, 19 offspring have been born and survived, still alive. But in that time, 34, not just young ones, but overall from the population, 34 have died. So, do the math. That's not sustainable. When you have that many, twice as many, more than twice as, well, almost twice as many deaths as you have births in the population, that isn't going to work. So here, to try to address that, looking at what they eat, it is almost entirely Chinook. And of course, this is only between May and September in Haro Strait. And we know that in the fall months, they do come down into Puget Sound, and that's where the chum are running, and that they do feast on chum. That's a side dish of theirs. So if this could be a year-round diet pie, it would include chum, But otherwise, it would probably be about the same. There's been almost no studies offshore of their prey. It's very hard to do, to get right behind them and, you know, scoop something up or see what they're eating. But what they have are, and this goes back to 2009, they have 2 samples. And they were both Columbia Basin salmon. One of them was Snake River salmon. So, you know, sample size of 2, but it does indicate that they're after those Chinook that are headed to spawn in the Columbia River, which is intuitive because that's what they eat around here, is those Chinook. But they're not doing very well. They're in really bad shape. Grim forecast is what we're seeing more and more. In 2019, only about 48,000 spring Chinook, which is their staple. They do eat fall Chinook as well, but they live on basically spring and summer, but mainly spring Chinook. And it's very, very low. 2018 forecast was for 107, but they only 67,000 showed up. So, you know, that's down from historically, if you go back 100 years, 1 million fish would go into the Snake River, which is the largest basin within the Columbia Basin for spawning salmon. And this is another way of looking at it. These are the smolt to adult ratio counts for the Snake River, for the upper dam, which is paradoxically the lower Granite Dam, is the upper of the 4 dams on the Snake River. And, you know, you've got to get to that bottom line to begin to maintain the same population at 1%. And 2 to 4% is necessary for any kind of recovery of a population. And look at that. I mean, they're down at, you know, basically almost 0. They're not returning. They can't get there. And yet the Middle Columbia, even after 4 dams in the Columbia main stem river, their counts are in the recovery range, 2 to 6% of smolt to adult ratios. This is from the Washington CBR. Let me see, what is that again? The Columbia count, anyway, conducted by UW. This is another way of looking at it. The counts are just drastic. They're down, you know, like 58% in 2018, and forecast to be even lower in 2019. So this is really drastic stuff. This is what they've eaten and thrived on for tens of thousands of years, and now it's almost gone. And their summer staple has been the Fraser. The Fraser has always had a nice run of Chinook. Nope, not there now. In the last just couple of years, they're in steep decline. So they're not around much in the summer like they used to be. That started to happen about 5 years ago, that we just didn't see them. I mean, it used to be, if you go back 20 years, they were here. A few of them, J's and sometimes K's, would show up by late April into May. By June, the L-pod would be in, and all of them would be in virtually every day for June and July, maybe miss a little in August, and then back again in September consistently. You know, we thought, okay, that's how it's always going to be. But they've been rare, seen only like 13 times in the summer. In 2013, 2017, I don't have the exact numbers, but ask anybody, they're just not around much in the summer anymore. In fact, this past year, they were seen in the fall going after chum in Puget Sound more than they were all summer around the San Juans. So, you know, they'll go where the fish are and the fish are not there. We hope they're finding something out there. And I will have to say, and it brought my spirits up, on January 11th when they were all photo documented, JK&L pod in Strait of Juan de Fuca, they didn't look that bad. There's one that does. Well, actually two, but that K25, the male, seems to be getting a little better. He looked really bad. You know, by bad I mean emaciated, and you can see it in the shape of their heads. But the female J17, a grandma and a new mom herself, is in very bad shape. And really, we may not see her again. But otherwise, they actually look better than I expected. So that's a relief. You know, maybe, you know, we're expecting the worst, but hoping for the best, and that was a good sign that day, January 11th. So this is sort of the overall population chart. It goes back to the mid-70s. Studies on San Juan began in 76, and so every year there are the counts, and we have the 2018 count as 74 of them, because that was before the baby was born in January. So now we're at 75, which is drastically low, but hope, you know, I don't know, you know, we hope they're finding something. We just don't know for sure what it is, because there's not that many Chinook salmon out there to sustain them. And yet, you know, like I say, they looked better than I would have expected. And I'm not just, you know, from my opinion, this is sort of across the board. So anyway, all of this, by this time last year, by March of 2018, had stirred up, you know, enough concerns just from that drastic drop in population you saw by then, that the governor issued an executive order to find out what's wrong and fix it. Orca recovery process, including the appointment of a task force. So that was in March. Task force started in the early summer, but then you may have all heard this, because J35 Tahlequah did more to raise global awareness of Southern residents than anything we have done in our whole history, which was by carrying her deceased calf around for 17 days. And that was daily headlines, and I'm talking all over the world. And so that really raised the concern. It was, you know, called a tour of grief. And it really showed people these whales are in trouble. When you look at that and then look at those statistics of 70% pregnancy failures and just the diminishing population overall. And then on the heels of that, in fact, overlapping with that, was the saga of 3-year-old J50 Scarlet, who basically weakened and died before our very eyes, you know, with teams trying to keep track, but trying not to bother her. And, you know, when you lose a female, especially, you know, in a dwindling population like that, that's a double whammy. And the calf, by the way, J35's calf was also a female, so that's drastic. So that really deepened the concern that was already there. So here was this task force that was about 48 people, representatives of all walks and industries and agencies, and organized to try to, you know, recover Southern resident orcas. Nobody had seen that kind of attention. I mean, it was really kind of exciting to see there was so much attention to helping the Southern residents. So, but the funny thing was that originally when they met in the early summer, before these incredible dramas played out on the water in front of all of us, they had not put restoring the Snake River, which means breaching the 4 dams on the Snake River. They had not put that on the table. But after all this citizen input of, you know, 250,000 signatures on a petition sent to the governor, he sent a note to the task force and said, put Snake River dams on the table. Much to his credit, let's talk about those dams. So that created a subgroup and a whole lot of attention on what to do about those dams. And this is sort of a sense of how they met, what they talked about. They would have fishbowl, tables with the 8 or 10 people on a particular topic at a time at the last one. But this is sort of the usual layout. And they came up in November with 36 different recommendations, and they cover a whole lot of different areas. And those are mostly up to the legislature right now. So they're sort of being played out, and they are, to some extent, Band-Aids. They'll do some good things, but there isn't in there, for one thing, just the budget that is needed to carry out the salmon restoration that is already shovel ready, that has been set out by the salmon recovery agencies, ready to go except for the funding, and that still isn't in those recommendations, even much less in front of the legislature right now. So I don't see the kind of complete, total dedication to getting the job done, doing whatever has to be done to restore those orcas coming out of this whole process. It's kind of hard to watch sometimes. It just seems inadequate. There are so many different interest groups represented, and they just seem to be representing their interests more than the whales' interests, even though they have the mandate to focus on what the whales need, what the southern residents need. But, and I do want to say this, we kind of go on about the Snake River dams, but every kind of restoration, probably a lot of you have been involved in that. They all do something. They're incremental. Planting trees, clearing out brambles. Sometimes it's dike removals. There's some really hard political choices sometimes, but every bit of it, cleaning up beaches. It all helps to clean up the environment, make it less toxic and more productive for, ultimately the whales, is our point of view, but the whole ecosystem benefits from all of these restoration efforts. And, I don't want to, dismiss all that because that's absolutely vital. But the biggest bang for the buck would be the Snake River restoration. I'm just, speaking for what is biologically indicated. That would be a huge influx of a lot of salmon in a really short time. Within a couple of years of breaching, the adults would come back into orca habitat available for their meals. And this gives you just an indication of what is known. Very little has been done offshore, and it's been done by satellite tag tracking, which proved to be disastrous a couple of years ago when L95 died from infections due to the tag, which are barbs, hooked barbs that go in a couple inches in their skin to hold that tag on. It's sort of a case of love the data, hate the method. And now actually I just heard about a new method using the technology invented by clingfish, imitating fish that have suction cups that are able to glom onto a surface like a whale's skin and stay there for weeks or months without penetrating, without causing any. Anyway, the data is still good, and this is just an indication of one day of one whale, but it's the typical one is they hover right around the mouth of the Columbia River, as we would expect, because that's where their favorite prey, their traditional food of Chinook salmon, are coming in to spawn. So the task force did finally give a recommendation to talk about the Snake River dams. But it's just, it's the stakeholders, which is, certainly they need to be included, but they're sort of the same players that deadlocked on the issue in the task force and didn't even want to talk about it in the first place. And it's sort of pegged to contribute to what is called the CRSO, the Columbia Snake River Operations Environmental Impact Statement, that is a process that is underway, which is sort of a new edition of EISs that have been written with, all the agencies, huge budgets, each takes a lot of time, each are inadequate because they don't actually recover the endangered salmon. I mean, that's what they're all for, because of the species of salmon in the Columbia and in the Snake River that were listed endangered. And so for 20 years, there have been 5 different EISs written, proposed, litigated, and failed in the courts because the numbers don't show they're going to recover the salmon. So this is another iteration of that, and I thought Joel Connolly nailed it. The battle has lasted longer than the 30 Years' War. It's become predictable. Agencies propose an inadequate plan, and a federal judge rejects it. That cycle has happened 5 times now, and this is probably destined to be the same. So this recommendation to feed into that is likely to follow the same path as repeat and rinse. And in the meantime, I mentioned J17. She is, sharpening our senses, just thinking about her, grandma and new mother, and that's how she looks. That maybe you need to sort of be familiar with how they should look, but that dip behind her skull is where her blubber should be. That should be a smooth form from the skull all the way back. And yet, having had to metabolize her blubber supply to survive, and she's not looking very good, she gets what they call a peanut head, which is that sort of that shape where the skull is basically exposed, or the shape of it. So she's not in good shape. We hope we'll see her again. Nobody really expects her to come through. There's this huge resistance. Why aren't the dams taken down? Why is this cycle repeated and failed again and again and again? There's just massive resistance, and it's coming from basically the agencies themselves, the Army Corps, the Bonneville Power Authority, even NOAA, which engages in writing the EISs and in advising how to try to recover those endangered salmon without touching the dams. That's the conundrum that really has not been solved because it can't be solved. The dams inherently block the river, prevent either the smolts from coming downstream or the adults from getting upstream. Yes?
What if you got rid of the sea lions?
Well, what if you got rid of the sea lions is the question, and that's one of the proposals, and they probably are going to go ahead, and there's a federal law to do that, but the biology isn't there. They'll come back. It just won't really put a dent in the losses of the salmon. Yes, sir?
When did the Snake River dams go in?
When did they? The Snake River dams went in the late 60s and early 70s. So after the main stem Columbia, still in the heyday and all of the promises of electrifying the eastern Washington and Oregon, and making Lewiston, Idaho into a seaport and a glittering city in the mountains. None of that has happened. I mean, sure, there's electricity. I could go into all of the different reasons, and we've written volumes, and there's a whole lot of research on this, and I could answer all of these other issues that are brought up to do instead of breaching the dams. you know, for all day. But when you come down to it, the dams are not producing revenue. They're costing taxpayers and ratepayers hundreds of millions of dollars to operate and maintain and to mitigate, to try with all kinds of hardware and sluices and weirs and barging and trucking and every other kind of technological fix to try to get the river to act like a river, to be hospitable for salmon. And none of it is working, but the budget keeps coming in. The allocations to do it keep coming in year after year, keeping everybody very busy and very well paid, but not recovering the salmon. And now we know it's not recovering the Southern Resident Orcas. And this just sort of gives you a sense of where we're talking about. This is the habitat, the spawning. It's actually 5,500 miles of near pristine roadless wilderness in southern Idaho that is some of the best high altitude Chinook, spring and summer Chinook spawning anywhere, certainly anywhere left in the world. Some of the biggest, the June hogs, the 80-pounders that used to come out of that system, they theoretically could still, but they can't get there and back. So those native runs are diminishing to extinction. They're, you know, the old try to replace them with hatchery fish, with industrially manufactured fish. Certainly the orcas will eat them, but they're not sustainable and they're massively expensive to keep going. So just to sort of give you a comparison of that habitat in that circle, you can, if you put that circle over on the Salish Sea, it pretty well encompasses most of the Salish Sea. And if you look a little closer at that habitat, it's a whole lot of southern Idaho. It's just, it's a vast area that is still very good spawning river, but the fish can't get there and back. We're a little over, but well, this is a kind of a complicated graph. But what it really points up is that on the bottom there, the way to do it, and you know, we try to advocate for the orcas, so this, you know, I don't want it to be a personal issue, you know, but orcas need those fish. And there would be about 8 million more smolts would get downstream, and that would add several 100,000 minimum, up to maybe 1 million salmon, adult salmon, within about 2 years in orca habitat. And there's nothing that will bring that number. But the process for doing it has been believed to be this long new EIS process, or maybe get congressional approval. But from inside intel of how the Army Corps really works, it's been found that what really has to happen, according to protocols and procedures that have been done in other instances, how the Army Corps works, is it's their project. Yes, it was approved by Congress to begin with, but it's their project. They can terminate it at any time. There's a process, right? A record of decision. And the studies were done. In fact, there's a 2002 EIS that has alternative number 4, breaching, how to do it, spells it out. And you don't have to blow up any concrete. It's all done by the earthen berms that are alongside all 4 of the dams. You just gouge those out and let the river run over and it'll finish the job. So it's not an expensive project. You got to do some preparation, get all the boats that want to come downstream, get them down. And, you know, there'll be a little bit of some railroad fortifying and maybe some highway work that'll have to be done. But most of that has been done, and that was there before the dams went in. So it's not that big of an issue, except that there's this massive political resistance to getting it done. So biologically, it could be done. Okay, question there, and
Should we write the Army Corps of Engineers and campaign?
yes, right to the Army Corps of Engineers. I've got some information on the table there. Write to me at info@orcanetwork.org. Just email me. I will give you the numbers to call. And there is a big campaign. Our main target, if you could call it that, is Governor Inslee, because if he feels that there is the political support, I think he knows. I mean, I have a lot of faith in him, but he is being pressured heavily, and he can't really speak out, as almost no other politician is willing to speak out. But if they get a sense that that's what the people want, if there is this sort of countervailing political force that says, you got to do this, then the governor representing us can tell the Army Corps, please do it. They can't make it. He doesn't have that authority, but the Army Corps would do it. In fact, they legally have to, because it's costing them so much money every year. So by our citizen input translated through our leaders, Governor Inslee in particular, that's how it could get done, just by recommending strongly, formally to the governor, please bring down those dams. And that would hopefully help the southern residents. And I mean, you know, the numbers are there. It would help sustain the southern residents.
We have just a few minutes for a couple of questions. Give your question as loud as you can. Howard will be able to repeat it. Probably be able to do 3 or 4 questions. But he said he would stay.
Yes.
If you don't get your question answered, we have till midnight, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Not a problem.
Howard, you just call.
I will. Okay, right there.
So
Yes,
is
ma'am.
it just the 4 Lower Snake, or what about the Columbia River?
Okay, is it just the 4 Lower Snake, or what about the Columbia River dams? Nobody's talking about the Columbia River dams. They actually are revenue generators. They're very valuable in many ways, mainly hydropower, but it's those 4 more. And those reservoirs are deadly. I mean, they all are, but as you saw with the smolt to adult ratio, they make it over the 4 lower Columbia main stem. They don't make it through the Snake River dams. And it's just, you know, it's in the numbers. So that's all we're talking about, is the Snake River dams. Yes, ma'am, back there.
I understand that this is one of the solutions, but I haven't heard any discussion about how much overfishing is contributing.
Right. The question is, what about overfishing? What about the harvest issue? And yes, that actually, if you could sort of, you know, wave a wand and cut out all Chinook fishing all up and down the coast, and a lot of it that is marketed as Alaska wild caught are actually headed for the Columbia or for Washington or even further south. So anyway, if you could cut all of that out, yes, that would probably be equivalent. Yes.
The second part of my question, I was wondering, I know that the tribes are certainly stakeholders in this process, and this is very much a part of their traditions and all the rest of it. Would it be just like a drop of water in the ocean if they were to change their fishing habits to comply more with commercial fishermen? And how much of an impact, if they would agree to that, I mean, nobody can make them do that, but if they would out of their own care for the situation, were to change their fishing habits, would that make a difference?
Right. Okay. The question is, what about tribal fishing? Would that make a difference? And it would certainly help. It would be a big part of it. I'm not authoritative on that, and it's very complicated, and there aren't good necessarily, you know, any clearinghouse of all of that information of what kind of fishing is done in what locations to be able to pinpoint that. But there is a lot of effort. The Northwest Indian Fisheries Council, has the question before them to certainly reduce drastically the amount of Chinook fishing. It's very specific. It's not that much right now, but there's a lot of bycatch. So, there's a lot that is just not recorded. But if you could actually monitor and reduce that significantly, that could add another 1 million or 2 adult salmon out there as well. It's just that to get that happen, when you're talking about, commercial, recreational, tribal, Canada, US, Alaska, that's just, the political tangles are almost impossible to get everybody to go along with that. Whereas the Army Corps could write a letter of decision and get those dams breached within a couple of months of the decision. Yes, sir?
Is there any data on the LWA?
Oh, the LWA.
Contributing to this?
Right. Questions, what about the LWA, which is a great thing to see the LWA come back. The data are that the amount of wild salmon that are spawning upstream of the dams is still pretty small. It's not significant in terms of the amount, but it's only been a couple of years, and they were totally blocked for 100 years. So, these are sort of pioneer Chinook that are finding those great habitat, spawning areas way upstream and recolonizing. And once those generations that are imprinted on that place come back and tailor their whole evolution, their whole anatomies to be able to make it to those spawning areas, that's just going to take another 10, 20 years before you get healthy, high altitude populations there. But it's coming along. It's just, it's going to take a little longer.
One last question.
Okay.
What are they doing about cleaning up the Duwamish?
Cleaning up the Duwamish, that's huge, but it's not neglected. There's a whole lot of effort going on there. I'm not an expert on that, but yeah, the Duwamish, formerly and still, to a much smaller degree, is a Chinook salmon producing river, along with another 8 or 10 up and down, especially the Fraser, but the Skagit. And they all need attention. The Duwamish was the industrial site for producing bombs and airplanes and everything else, and so it's so toxic. And so, but there's success stories. It's I don't know, you'd have to go to the Department of Ecology and look for what they have. But I mean, yeah, that's another one, but it's not as big, it's not, or as fixable as the Snake River wilderness area. So.
Thank you so much, Howard. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yes.
We will stay with the